theory would be Blu-ray versus HD DVD, where you had two relatively similar products. And they spent years beating each other over the head trying to be the one and only product.
Yep,
So they kept playing the high strategy.
that's right.
And eventually, one won and the other one lost. So you eventually ended up with a 5 and a 0. But by the time they actually won, the online movie services were sufficiently mature that Blu-ray has never really taken off.
Right, right.
And you can go out and buy a Blu-ray player for $75.
Yeah.
They had hoped to have more time
And-
to sort of sell those at a higher premium.
So in the end, if they'd come up with some kind of joint solution, they would have probably been better off for a longer period of time.
And I'm not a lawyer. There are lawyers here that can address some of those things. There are things you can and can't do in that space in terms of colluding and things that you can coordinate.
Well, they could have standardized their solution. What they did is they came with two separate standards that were incompatible.
And there's lots of examples like that. What happened
Same
is
as data in VHS.
Yeah, it was the same game all over again, except nothing was there to replace VHS for 15, 20 years.
Now, there's a perfect example of what competing strategies can work together, which is Apple and Microsoft. Now, one of the largest investors in Apple is Bill Gates. They buy his Office products, all of his Exchange servers and Windows servers are 100% compatible, and both Microsoft and Apple have benefited from that quasi-partnership.
That's right. And so there would be two people playing the low, two organizations playing the low, because playing the high what didn't provide a quality end solution.
That's right. They would have been having both been losing in the end.
right. And in that space, you can argue they both saw the fact that the market potential was very high.
Well,
So even if you play the low strategy,
before Apple
you can
got
actually-
huge again, Gates had to go into, so he had some competition, and that's why he did it.
Entirely
He
true.
couldn't be a monopoly.
Yeah. Then
and if
he,
you look at industry after industry, whether it's telecom, what we saw in the cellular communication space, healthcare, defense, you see this kind of things play out. So when we're thinking about some of the dynamic elements, competitive dynamic elements in clean technology, we can actually look at some other examples. It's not going to answer the question for you as to what will actually happen, but it'll give you some ideas about what might happen, how things have played out over time. Which is a good segue into alternative futures. In the alternative futures exercise, our goal is not to predict a specific future. That's kind of how we typically think about a future. The world will look like this. So therefore, I must do things to meet the world there. The world is a very difficult to predict environment. So what I like to tell my clients is, instead of thinking about what is going to happen, you think about a range of different things that might happen. And this is actually based on some work that Royal Dutch Shell did decades ago in scenario planning. The story goes something like this. Back in the 70s, there was a up-and-coming manager who wrote a paper that talked about what might happen if the price per barrel of oil hit $50 a barrel. And at the time, oil was about $10 a barrel. So this was kind of crazy. He wrote a little white paper. And somehow that got floated around to different vice presidents. Got floated around. And they actually started asking the question, what would happen? Well, a lot of things would change. We would now start working here, because right now it's not profitable, but it may become profitable. And we would change our organization this way, and our production would be like this, and the way we would hire would look like this. This crazy world of $50 oil, if that were to happen, this is what we would do. And lo and behold, in 10 years, there were 2 oil shocks, and it went well above $50. Back in the 70s, Shell Oil was not a major player. It was number 8, number 9, 10, and beyond. And many credit Shell's use of scenario planning as the reason it's what allowed them to jump from where they were to the number 3 large oil country in the world. What's interesting with what Shell has done with scenario planning is that over the years, it's gotten much more developed. Many years ago, you had to sort of know somebody at Shell to get a copy of what their scenarios look like. And what they do now is they actually come up with 2 views of the world. They actually have icons, and they actually build out the story about what might happen in this world, the world of blueprints, and the world of Scramble. And it used to be that many years ago you had to know somebody at Shell to sort of get a sense of what they thought the two worlds might look like. There's two amazing things that Shell has done in the last, I think about 10 years. Number one, they've now published this and made it publicly available. You can go to Shell's website and get this PDF and download this Shell's viewpoint about the two competing things that might happen. The other thing is they've integrated the way they use these scenarios into a lot of their decision-making process. Let's say you're an engineer and you have a plan about expanding a facility, a 3-year plan that looks like this. Somebody will ask you, well, how does that work out in blueprints, and how does that work out in Scramble? Or you have a hiring plan. I want to hire these many people, these kinds of engineers in the next 2 years. How does it play out in blueprints? How does it play out in Scramble? And the point here is not to predict, again, not to predict what might happen, but it's to think about the range of possibilities so that you can be ready. So you can think about, well, if that did happen, I would do these different things. If that did happen, here's what that would mean for me. And they encourage this kind of thinking, not just for executive, but down to the managers. The kind of plans, you're doing IT planning, here's what that means. Because that might mean a slowdown, that might mean the labor might look like this. And for each of the scenarios, actually think through the different criteria. What does it mean for choice? What does it mean for oil and gas and coal and different kinds of energies? What does it mean for these different things? And I've adapted this for use with some of the client work that I've done. And one of the clients that I've worked with, we came with 2 scenarios. One was called status quo. This was done a few years ago when we were right in the middle of all the economic downturn. We came up with 2 possible worlds. One was a status quo, where the overall stagnation and slowdown continues, and it continues to hamper the consumer demand. And then we had another scenario where we talked about the next generation. The recovery is led by optimism and consumption by a new generation of consumers. And I want to show you something here, because one of my clients thought this would be kind of interesting. One of the things that we talked about in the geopolitical space was that, here we go, you might be able to see some isolated incidents of riots and instability that arise from local economic conditions. And at the time, you weren't trying to predict the Arab Spring or anything like that, but this client had offices and they had customers around the world, and it allowed them to sort of think through not the causes of that, but sort of what that might mean to the distribution that we've got, the employees that we've got, and those kinds of things. So we had a chance to sort of talk through SWOT analysis. You guys were gracious enough to play some game theory exercises, and we talked a little bit about alternative futures. There are clearly other kinds of tools that are out there from the world of strategic planning. And what I wanted to do was talk to you today about the ecosystem and some of the tools from competitive strategy. My hope is that you, as innovators, and as educators, as investors, as instigators, are able to use some of the things that we talked about today, how we think about the ecosystem, and some of the tools that we talked about to succeed in this ecosystem. Thank you.
Q&A, everyone's
Comments?
welcome to...
Yes.
Could you say that the 2 different games we played are more like a sealed bid versus an open RFP?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things I was trying to get at was maybe you have a different set of behaviors when you know your competitor and you know you're going to play with that competitor in competing in succeeding rounds, as opposed to not knowing who your competitor is. Are you more aggressive when the opponent doesn't know who you are? Those kinds of things. Absolutely. Any other comments or questions?
What kind of strategic planning did BP use for their rig in the Gulf?
BP's an interesting place. It's any of these large oil companies are $100 billion plus in revenue with tens of thousands of people everywhere.
When they look in the mirror, they see.
Sorry?
And when they look in the mirror, what do they see?
I think what they see is they're quite ashamed of what's happened. Some of the people that I've talked to. There's also a lot of good people. I've done work for BP at several places. I haven't done any stuff offshore with them. All my work has been in onshore and gas, but I have done work for offshore drilling as well. That's an amazing world with a lot of engineers and a lot of smart people that are out there. But it's fraught with a lot of danger and a lot of risk.
Howard,
Yes.
in your strategic planning, do you utilize any type of qualitative or quantitative software to assist you in your decision making?
I do, and it really depends on what you're trying to solve. So one of the reasons why, let's see if this works. One of the reasons why I show you the methodology is I typically try not to think of the.
You're killing me.
Is this one of these handheld camera things?
All right, so
Getting
going
seasick.
into the business problem, I try not to say, therefore you must use this tool, because it's not about the tools. It's about using the tools to come up with a solution. So you frame the problem correctly, and then you build a qualitative model, and then you bring the data. Along the way is when you think about what tools you use. So there's a lot of different packages I use. I use a lot of packages for the actual calculation, whether it's working with databases or the simulation, specific simulation software. Sometimes the tools that I use are for visualization purposes. I utilize something called information design, which isn't software. It's a way of thinking about how we view information. The use of colors, the use of
Like mind maps.
shapes. Sorry?
A little bit like mind maps.
Yes, yes. Mind mapping. I use mind mapping to sort of come up with the outline here. But there's a lot of different tools that are out there for both analysis, but you have to sort of think about what you're using the tools for. Are you using it to figure out what the problem is, brainstorming? Are you using it to figure out what the qualitative model is, good process maps, those kinds of things? Are you using it to do the rigorous computational stuff? Are you using it to do the visualization and explaining the answers? You have to sort of think through what my tool set is and what you're using it for.
And also your client.
Absolutely, absolutely. Some clients are more technically inclined than others. Some clients want the splashy view. It just depends on what your client is, absolutely, your audience. Yes?
And when you're determining the alternative futures, I mean, there's an infinite number of futures you could choose.
That's right, that's
And
right.
if you're choosing like the best case and worst case, but then there's this excluded middle, how do you,
I try not to describe it as a best case and worst case. That's not a bad way to do it. We talk about the P9, P95 solutions, those kinds of things. What I try to do with the alternative solutions is to actually build out the story behind these scenarios. So it's not about the worst case and the best case. It's sort of a good case and a bad case. But instead of focusing on how likely that's to happen, we try not to quantify that's a 2% solution or that's a 50% likelihood. What we do is we really try to think about the story that goes with that. So what does that mean for what are the things that might cause that? What are the things that it might mean for your people or their technology implications or energy use, those kinds of things. So it's really less about quantifying exactly how likely those are, but more about really helping to use that as a discussion to think about the things that are behind it.
But they can help you develop some trigger points. Like the $50 barrel oil, when that happens, this is the plan we're going to execute.
That's right. And what's important about that is and this is more the case in larger organizations. If you've got an organization of 10 people or 200 people, it's easier to make changes and truck along. If you're 1,000 people, or you're dealing with an ecosystem that's unknown number of people, it's hard to make a decision that's significant very quickly and pull it off. So that's when scenario planning and the alternative futures exercises are quite helpful. Yes?
in general, do you find that businesses' attention span to problems are greater today, is expanding, or their attention span to dealing with their problems and issues is contracting compared to 5 years ago, 6 years ago?
It's a very good question. I think a lot of it depends on the individual within the organization. And in an organization, you can still find a lot of variance. There are still folks that are very much concerned about this week or this month or the earnings quarter, but then there are folks that are much thinking about the decade and what the industry is doing. So when you ask me to compare sort of what's happening now versus, say, 5 years ago, I think I'm running into more people that are